He is 78 years old, sitting somewhere quiet in Sweden, hands folded, the kind of stillness that only comes after decades of noise. And for the first time in his life, Benny Andersson is telling the truth, not the polished version, not the one that fits neatly on a greatest hits sleeve, wrapped in nostalgia and platform boots. The real one. He leans forward, and he says a sentence that quietly undoes 50 years of assumptions. ABBA worked because we were broken. The music made us feel whole. For people who sold the world a fantasy of shimmering harmony were, underneath every platinum record, underneath every glittering chorus, quietly falling apart. And the man who wrote the chords beneath Dancing Queen and The Winner Takes It All is only now admitting what he could never say back then, that the songs were never really about joy. They were about survival. They were the closest he ever came to telling anyone the truth. To understand what that confession cost him, you have to go back to a boy who never wanted to be famous at all. Before the world knew his name, Benny Andersson was a child who loved sound more than attention. Raised on Swedish accordion tunes and the solemn harmonies of church music, he learned early that a melody could hold feelings a sentence never could. He wasn't chasing stardom in those years. He was chasing a particular kind of silence, the one that falls right after a chord finally resolves. That instinct followed him his entire life, long after the spotlights found him and refused to let go. While Bjorn shaped the words, Benny shaped the ache underneath them. The minor key hiding inside a major one, the sadness folded quietly into a song that made millions dance without ever knowing why it moved them so deeply. He wasn't just composing pop hits. He was translating pain into something people could hum on the way to work, cry to at weddings, sing at karaoke bars decades later, without understanding what they were really singing. And so, when ABBA exploded into the biggest pop phenomenon on Earth, Benny was never the one people screamed for. Agnetha and Frida stood in the light, their faces on every magazine cover, their voices what the world fell in love with first. Benny stood behind the glass, adjusting a single harmony for the 40th time, chasing a feeling he couldn't always name, could barely describe even to himself. He has since admitted something startling, that he never fully felt seen inside the band he helped build, not as an artist, not as a man. He was the architect of a sound the entire world would come to know by heart within a single generation, and somehow, astonishingly, he remained the most invisible person inside it, the one nobody photographed, the one nobody asked. That invisibility became the defining shape of his life, and nowhere did it cut deeper than in his relationship with Annie Frid Lyngstad. It didn't begin with romance. It began in the studio, late at night, in the strange in-between space where work and intimacy blur until neither one has a name anymore. Frida brought heat and instinct into every session. She felt everything loudly, urgently, without apology, without the need to translate it first. Benny brought the opposite, careful, contained, a man who could pour his entire soul into 8 bars of music, but go quiet the moment the tape stopped rolling, and the real conversation was supposed to begin. For a while, that contrast made their music extraordinary. It also, slowly and almost invisibly, made their marriage impossible. Both of them carried old wounds into that studio, wounds neither fully understood yet. Frida had grown up with abandonment stitched into her earliest memories, a childhood defined by absence. Benny had learned, long before ABBA existed, to swallow what he felt rather than risk speaking it aloud. Neither of them had the tools to simply say, "I'm hurting." So instead, they wrote songs about it. The Winner Takes It All. One of Us. The world heard aching breakup ballads, radio perfect and endlessly replayed. Frida heard her own heartbreak, sung back to her note for note, in front of millions of strangers. And Benny has now admitted the songs weren't confessions at all. They were an exit, a carefully constructed way to say the unsayable without ever having to sit across from her and say it to her face, in the quieter room, with nowhere to hide. He put it more plainly than anyone expected, years later, in a single devastating sentence. I gave my best lines to songs, not to the people who needed to hear them from me. Sit with that for a second. That's not a man bragging about his own genius. That's a man confessing to an entire lifetime of loving people through a piano, instead of loving them directly, in real time, with all the risk that requires. He wasn't cold. He wasn't cruel. He was terrified terrified of the kind of vulnerability that can't be edited, rewound, or perfected in a mix. Music let him control the pain, shape it, resolve it exactly the way he needed it resolved. Real conversation offered no such mercy. And so he built walls out of melody, brick by beautiful brick, and the world called it art, never once suspecting it was also armor. The tragedy is that it worked commercially spectacularly, and failed personally completely. Frida needed presence. Benny gave her product, however brilliant. Their bond thrived under studio lights and quietly dissolved everywhere else, until what the world called chemistry was, in truth, a very well-produced kind of distance. Two people standing close enough to sound perfect together, and too far apart to actually reach one another. But Frida wasn't the only casualty of Benny's silence. There was a second, quieter wound, one about identity itself, one that had nothing to do with romance at all. While the world obsessed over which woman was more beautiful, more talented, more photogenic, an entirely different rivalry was unfolding in the shadows, one nobody ever wrote headlines about. Benny, alone, competing not against Agnetha or Frida, but against his own erasure from the very thing he'd built. He and Bjorn were filed away as the men behind the music. A footnote to two faces of cameras actually wanted, two names magazines actually printed. Every award, every cover story, every scream from the crowd landed on the women, while the man who built the emotional architecture beneath every single song stood just outside the frame, unacknowledged, unnamed, unseen. He was labeled unfairly and repeatedly as the cold brain of ABBA, technical, clinical, calculating, unfeeling. And that label may be the cruelest irony of his entire career, because the truth was the exact opposite. He wasn't cold. He was pouring everything he had into those chord changes. Grief, longing, guilt he couldn't name anywhere else. And the world called the result pop fluff. Catchy, disposable, 3 minutes of sugar. Nobody credited the tears in the audience to the man who had engineered the sadness into the song in the first place. Note by deliberate note. For decades, Benny carried that quietly, not as bitterness toward his bandmates. He's been clear about that, but as a private, persistent ache. The sense that the most honest part of himself was also the part no one ever thought to go looking for. By the late 70s, all of it, the endless touring, the exhaustion, the emotional erosion nobody was naming out loud because there was no time, no permission, no vocabulary for it, began to catch up with the band all at once. There was no explosive fight, no tabloid scandal, no single moment anyone could later point to and say this is when it ended. It was quieter than that, and somehow far sadder. Benny remembers the exact sensation of the music starting to feel dishonest. The spark that once made a new chord progression feel like a discovery instead started to feel like an obligation, a task to complete rather than a truth to uncover. He kept showing up not out of passion anymore, but guilt, a fear of letting the others down after everything they'd built together. He stayed inside a dying thing because he genuinely didn't know how to be the one who ended it. Didn't know what words you were even supposed to use. And so it simply stopped. No summit, no goodbye, no group conversation about what any of them were actually feeling underneath the exhaustion. Frida had already begun detaching emotionally long before the official end ever arrived. She found her own way to closure early, on her own terms. Benny didn't have that luxury, or maybe that clarity. It would take him another decade to even understand how unfinished it all still was inside him, that the band hadn't simply broken up one afternoon, that something in him had quietly gone with it, unnoticed, unmourned. He calls it now, with the clarity only distance can provide, exactly what it actually was. Not a scandal, not a headline-worthy collapse, but a creative death, a slow, invisible unraveling that the public, hungry as always for drama and villains, never even noticed happening until it was already long over. What came after wasn't comeback. It was an exile he chose deliberately, almost gratefully. Benny disappeared from the pop machine entirely and buried himself in theater and film scores, chess, Christina Fran de Vemola, work that asked nothing of him but honesty, work with no charts to climb and no image left to protect. There were no fans to perform for in quite the same way, no bandmates to manage or smooth over, no myth to keep polished, just him and the music, stripped down to something closer to the truth. And it was there alone, far from any stage, that he finally started writing the words he had never once said out loud, actual letters, Unsent, every one of them. Addressed to Frida, to Agnetha, to Bjorn. Page is filled with every unspoken apology and unresolved feeling from a decade. He had survived by composing instead of confessing, by performing instead of admitting. He didn't send a single one of those letters, but he wrote them again and again for years. And in doing so, he began, for the first time in his adult life, to actually feel the things he'd spent an entire career translating into sound for other people to feel instead. That's the man who sits before us now at 78, no longer performing peace, no longer protecting a myth he helped build brick by brick. He isn't rewriting ABBA's story to make it prettier or more comfortable. He's finally telling the way it actually happened. For extraordinary, deeply human people who were never as unshakable as the world needed them to be, who were improvising their way through fame with no map and no instructions. We weren't a fairy tale, he says now without flinching, without softening it for anyone. We were four people trying not to fall apart. The music was the only thing holding us together. It wasn't fame that fractured them, and it wasn't the tabloid rumors circling their private lives either. It was a simple, unbearable fact that they were too human to carry the weight the entire world had quietly placed on their shoulders. And the music, the very thing that made them immortal, was also the thing they used again and again to avoid ever truly facing each other. And maybe that's the real reason Dancing Queen still plays at every wedding 50 years later. Why grown adults still find themselves crying during The Winner Takes It All without fully understanding why. Because underneath every one of those perfect pop hooks is a confession nobody was brave enough to say out loud at the time, written instead into a melody, smuggled quietly past everyone's defenses, including, perhaps most of all, the defenses of the man who wrote it. Benny Andersson spent a lifetime saying the truest things he ever felt through a piano, because the piano would never leave him, never need him to be someone he wasn't, never ask for more than he was able to give in that moment. Now, decades later, with nothing left to protect and no image left worth preserving, he's finally saying the only way that's left to him, out loud, in his own voice, without a single chord left to hide behind. Not as the architect of a phenomenon the whole world once sang along to, just as a man at last, telling us who he really was underneath all that beautiful, aching sound, and who, perhaps for the very first time, is letting himself be truly heard.